This is the World Organic News, the week ending 2nd of July 2018. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air and recarbonise the soil. We begin this week with a post from the developer of the Grow Biointensive Growing System entitled How Sustainable is Your Grow Biointensive Garden by John Jeavons. Quote, Grow Biointensive, registered trademark, sustainable mini-farming is a remarkable method for increasing yields, decreasing resource use and building soil fertility at very low cost. When used properly, it has the potential to change our world for the better. However, when putting this method into practice, it is important to be aware that Grow Biointensive is a whole system, and that the components of the system must all be used together to be sustainable. End quote. Noble sentiments indeed. The post goes on to direct the reader, and it must be assumed practitioner, to a download. Here the first two checkboxes on this sheet to determine your level of sustainability are 1. Manual double digging, 24/60 centimetres deep, to establish or re-establish good soil structure. 2. Surface cultivation, 2 inches 5 centimetres deep, once good soil structure is established to maximise preservation of soil structure. These are the minimum starting points for the system. Now, this system was one of the first of the new organic ones that arose with the 1970s. A bit like John Seymour's methods, it was based in a time when soil carbon was not understood as well as it is now. Composting and closed cycles are part of the system, but the digging, or to be more precise, the double digging and then surface cultivation, are things to be avoided like the plague. I'm a little perplexed as to how these create good soil structure, but it is a system of its time. We are now at a time when we can feed the world easily with regenerative systems that do not require back-breaking labour of a repetitive nature. I applaud the pioneers who stood up in the 1960s and 70s and those further back, but the time has come to use agriculture/gardening to rebalance the carbon cycle. I suspect the Grow Biointensive system could quite easily be converted to no-dig. That being so, the rest of the system seems to be relatively carbon-friendly. Our next post is also from John Jeavons, entitled Hedgerows, Living Fences for Fruit, Nuts, Building Materials, Bird and Beneficial Insect Habitat, plus Animal Protection. And I quote, Hedgerows is an Old English term that refers to narrow planting strips of trees or shrubs that grow along field borders, fence lines and waterways. These borders serve as effective windbreaks and improve conditions for the nearby crops, forming an edge habitat that supports ecological diversity. Hedges have been used around the world since the Stone Age, and hedgerows were first mentioned officially in Europe in the 12th century. Through time, these living fences, some hundreds of years old, became an integral part of many farming regions until recently, when they became unpopular because they waste space in the field. End quote. The ripping out of hedgerows has been a travesty. The post goes on to state that yields dropped after the hedgerows were removed, and I wouldn't be at all surprised. Clearly they make ploughing boundary fence to boundary fence more complicated, but they do provide a huge range of environmental services. Nesting spaces for birds, flower resources for bees spring to mind. They also provide shelter for stock in the paddocks they surround and modify microclimates. All in all, a good thing. Jeavons goes on to point out that a particular book he's reading, Hedgerows by Eric Thomas and John T. White, is now out of print. There is, however, a link in the show notes for used copies on Amazon. Now we come to a sobering post from CBS Detroit entitled Farmers in America are Killing Themselves in Staggering Numbers. Quote, Think about trying to live today on the income you had 15 years ago. That's how agriculture expert Chris Hurt describes the plight facing US farmers today. The unequal economy that's emerged over the past decade, combined with patchy access to health care in rural areas, have had a severe impact on people growing America's food. Recent data shows just how much. Farmers are dying by suicide at a higher rate than any other occupational group, according to the Centres for Disease Control and Prevention. End quote. I have covered farmer suicides previously. On those occasions, I was focusing on the plight of farmers in India. I know from living in Australia that suicide amongst Australian farmers increases with the length of droughts. In that case, though, people are aware and safety networks are in place for farmers and mental health nurses to check in on each other and spot early signs. Again from the Post, quote, "In the US, several long-time farm advocates say today's crisis mirrors one that happened in the 1980s, with many US farmers struggling economically, with an accompanying spike in farmer suicides. The farm crisis was so bad there was a terrible outbreak of suicide and depression," said Jennifer Fay, Communications Director with Farm Aid, a group founded in 1985 that advocates for farmers. "Today," she said, "I think it's actually worse." End quote. The fact that farms have become larger over time and farmers relatively more isolated at the same time means the community supports that once were the hallmark of rural life are no longer there. That being the case, public funding from those who are alive because of the food farmers produce would seem a reasonable thing to implement, but, and I quote again, "The Senate version of the Farm Bill allocates $20 million to a program to connect farmers with behavioural health services, and such programs are even more crucial today," said Fay, "because many publicly funded programs that were created in the wake of the 1980s farm crisis have been chipped away over the years." She points to Minnesota, where a suicide hotline closed earlier this month after a budget dispute between the legislature and the governor, end quote. This does seem to be a vicious cycle. If you know someone on the land, reach out, be a friend and an ear. I know suicide is across all sectors of life, and I've had the terrifying privilege of talking a few people through these moments and keeping them safe. Stay connected, people. This is important. Let's just take a deep breath before I move on. Now to a more positive point. In the last 2 weeks, I was contacted by a listener. Now, I can't find where they contacted me, so I'm unable to thank them by name. If it's you listening now who talked to me about no-dig and shallow cultivation, please get back in touch. The point of this diversion is to say thank you for the correspondence and to announce a new page on the website, creatively named Free Downloadable PDF Farming Books. There is, of course, a link in the show notes. On this page so far, I've links to The One Straw Revolution by Masanobu Fukuoka and a book by Edmund Morris from the 1870s entitled 10 Acres Enough. The latter is definitely not a no-dig treatise, but it's a great read on his philosophy of living rural rather than suburban or urban. In further news, read Decarbonise the Air, we have a piece from the ABC in Australia entitled Giant Water Battery in Far North Queensland Gets Conditional Approval for $500 million Loan. Quote, Australia's first renewable energy project to combine solar energy and pumped hydro storage has been given conditional approval for $500 million in funding. End quote. This is a topic I've covered before. It was a theory that seemed to make sense. Old technology with all the bugs worked out. Basically a hydro system that doesn't rely on running water as in a dam across a river, but on solar energy to lift water to a higher reservoir and then gravity to drop the water to a lower one. The pump that gets the water up becomes a generator as the water travels from top to bottom to meet demand for electricity, and it also overcomes the need for millions of AA batteries by using water and potential energy rather than lithium and chemical energy. Some 22,000 sites have been identified across Australia as having potential for this technology. Once this particular site is up and running, I see it as another nail in the coffin for fossil fuel electricity production. I'll keep you posted as the development becomes a reality. And with that, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Remember, decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil, and keep in touch with people. As a podcast listener, you may be thinking of producing your own podcast, but you're not sure where to begin. Drop over to mrjohnmoore.com, link in the show notes, and pick up the free checklists I've written to help get you started. I'm also doing live presentations twice a week and putting them up as podcasts to help you through the process. These are also in the left-hand sidebar on mrjohnmoore.com. And a transcript of this episode is available at worldorganicnews.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week.